The Sword and the Stone, Chapter 14. In the autumn, everybody was preparing for the winter. At night, they spent the time rescuing Daddy Longlegs from their candles and rushlights. In the daytime, the cows were turned into the high stubble and weeds which had been left by the harvest sickles. The pigs were driven into the purlieus of the forest, where boys beat the trees to supply them with acorns. Everybody was at a different job. From the granary there proceeded an invariable thumping of flails. In the strip fields, the slow and enormously heavy wooden plows sailed up and down for the rye and the wheat, while the sowers swung rhythmically along, with their hoffers round their necks, casting right hand for left foot, and vice versa. Foraging parties came lumbering in with their spike-wheeled carts full of bracken, remarking wisely that they must get whom with ye breaks ere all summer be gone, for tethered-up cattle to sit down upon, while others dragged in timber for the castle fires. The forest rang in the sharp air with the sound of beetle and wedge. Everybody was happy. The Saxons were slaves to their Norman masters, if you chose to look at it one way. But if you chose to look at it in another, they were the same farm laborers who get along on too few shillings a week today. Only neither the villain nor the farm laborer starved, while the master was a man like Sir Ector. It has never been an economic proposition for an owner of cattle to starve his cows, so why should an owner of slaves starve them? The truth is that even nowadays the farm laborers accept so little money because he does not have to throw his soul in with the bargain, as he would have to do in a town. And the same freedom of spirit has obtained in the country since the earliest times. The villains were laborers. They lived in the same one-roomed hut with their families, few chickens, litter of pigs, or with a cow possibly called Crumbach, most dreadful and insanitary. But they liked it. They were healthy, free of an air with no factory smoke in it, and, which was most of all to them, their heart's interest was bound up with their skill and labor. They knew that Sir Ector was proud of them. They were more valuable to him than his cattle even, and, as he valued his cattle more than anything else except his children, this was saying a good deal. He walked and worked among his villagers, thought of their welfare, and could tell the good workmen from the bad. He was the eternal farmer, in fact. One of those people who seem to be employing labor at so many shillings a week, but who are actually paying half as much again in voluntary overtime, providing a cottage free, and possibly making an extra present of milk and eggs and home-brewed beer into the bargain. In other parts of Gramarye, of course, there did exist wicked and despotic masters, feudal gangsters whom it was to be King Arthur's destiny to chasten. But the evil was in the bad people who abused it, not in the feudal system. Sir Ector was moving through these activities with a brow of thunder, when an old lady who was sitting in a hedge by one of the strips of wheat to scare away the rooks and pigeons suddenly rose up beside him with an unearthly screech. He jumped nearly a foot in the air. He was in a nervous condition. "Dang it," said Sir Ector. Then, considering the subject more attentively, he added in a loud, indignant voice, "Splendor of God!" He took the letter out of his pocket and read it again. The overlord of the castle of Forest Savage was more than a farmer. He was a military captain, who was ready to organize and lead the defense of his estate against the gangsters. And he was a sportsman, who sometimes took a day's jousting when he could spare the time. But he was not only these. Sir Ector was an MFH, or rather a master of stag and other hounds, and he hunted his own pack himself. Clumsy, Trownier, Phoebe, Colley, Gerlin, Talbot, Lewith, Leffra, Apollon, Orthros, Bran, Gellert, Bounce, Boy, Lion, Bungie, Toby, Diamond, and Cavall were not pet dogs. They were the Forest Savage hounds, no subscription, 2 days a week, Huntsman, the master. This is what the letter said, if we translate it from Latin. The King to Sir Ector, etc. We send you William Twidey, our huntsman, and his fellows to hunt in the Forest Savage with our boarhounds, Cannabis nostris porcorus, in order that they may capture 2 or 3 boars. You are to cause the flesh they capture to be salted and kept in good condition, but the skins you are to cause to be bleached, which they give you, as the said William shall tell you. And we command you to provide necessaries for them as long as they shall be with you by our command, and the cost, etc., shall be accounted, etc. Witnessed at the Tower of London, 20th of November, in the 12th year of our reign. Uther Pendragon, 12 Uther. Now the forest belonged to the king, and he had every right to send his hounds to hunt in it. Also, he maintained a number of hungry mouths, what with his court and his army. so that it was natural that he should want as many dead boars, bucks, roes, etc., to be salted down as possible. He was in the right. This did not take away the fact that Sir Ector regarded the forest as his forest, and resented the intrusion of the royal hounds, as if his own would not do just as well. The king had only to send for a couple of boars, and he would have been delighted to supply them himself. He feared that his coverts would be disturbed by a lot of wild royal retainers, never know what these city chaps will be up to next, and that the king's huntsman, this fellow Twidey, would sneer at his humble hunting establishment, unsettle the hunt servants, and perhaps even try to interfere with his own kennel management. In fact, Sir Ector was shy. Then there was another thing. Where the devil were the royal hounds to be kept? Was he, Sir Ector, to turn his own hounds into the street, so as to put the king's hounds in his kennels? Splendor of God, repeated the unhappy master. It was as bad as paying tithes. Sir Ector put the accursed letter in his pocket, and stumped off the ploughing. The villains, seeing him go, remarked cheerfully, "Our wold meester be on the gad again, seemingly." It was a confounded piece of tyranny, that was what it was. It happened every year, but it was still that. He always solved the kennel problem in the same way, but it still worried him. He would have to invite his neighbors to the meet specially, to look as impressive as possible under the royal huntsman's eye, and this would mean sending messengers through the forest to Sir Grummer, etc. Then he would have to show sport. The king had written early, so that evidently he intended to send the fellow at the very beginning of the season. The season did not begin till the 25th of December. Probably the chap would insist on one of those damned Boxing Day meets, all show-off and no business, with hundreds of foot people all hollerin' and headin' the boar and trampin' down the seeds and spoilin' sport generally. How the devil was he to know in November where the best boars would be on Boxing Day? What with sounders and gorgeons and hog steers, you never knew where you were. And another thing, a hound that was going to be used next summer for the proper heart huntin' was always entered at Christmas to be the boar. It was the very beginning of his education, which led up through hares and whatnots to its real quarry, and this meant that the fellow Twidey would be bringing down a lot of raw puppies, which would be nothing but a plague to everybody. Dang it, said Sir Ector, and stamped upon a piece of mud. He stood gloomily for a moment, watching his two boys trying to catch the last leaves in the chase. They had not gone out with that intention, and did not really, even in those distant days, believe that every leaf you caught would mean a happy month next year. Only, as the west wind tore the golden rags away, they looked fascinating and difficult to catch. For the mere sport of catching them, of shouting and laughing and feeling giddy as they looked up, and of darting about to trap the creatures, which were certainly alive in the cunning with which they slipped away, the two boys were prancing about like young fawns in the ruin of the year. Wart's shoulder was well again. The only chap, reflected Sir Ector, who could be really useful in showing the king's huntsmen proper sport was that fellow Robin Hood. Robin Wood, they seemed to be calling him now. Some newfangled idea, no doubt. But Wood or Hood, he was the chap to know where a fine tush was to be found. Been feasting on the creatures for months now. He would not be surprised, even if they were out of season. But you could hardly ask a fellow to hunt up a few beasts of venery for you, and then not invite him to the meet. While, if you did invite him to the meet, what would the king's huntsmen and the neighbors say at having a partisan for a fellow guest? Not that this Robin Wood was not a good fellow. He was a good chap, and a good neighbor, too. He had often tipped Sir Ector the wink when a raiding party was on its way from the marches, and he never molested the knight or his farming in any way. What did it matter if he did chase himself a bit of venison now and then? There was 400 square miles of forest, so they said, and enough for all. Leave well alone, that was Sir Ector's motto. But that did not alter the neighbors. Another thing was the riot. It was all very well for the crack hunts in practically artificial forests like those at Windsor, where the king hunted. But it was a different thing in the forest savage. Suppose His Majesty's famous hounds were to go run and riot after a unicorn or something. Everybody knew that you could never catch a unicorn without a young virgin for bait, in which case the unicorn meekly laid its white head and mother-of-pearl horn in her lap. And so the puppies would go charging off into the forest for leagues and leagues and never catch it, and get lost. And then what would Sir Ector say to his sovereign? It was not only unicorns. There was the beast Gladysent that everybody had heard so much about. If you had the head of a serpent, the body of a leopard, the haunches of a lion, and were footed like a hart, and especially if you made a noise like 30 couple of hounds questin', it stood to reason that you would account for an excessive number of royal puppies before they pulled you down. Serve them right, too. And what would King Pellinore say if Master William Twitty did succeed in killing his beast? Then there were the small dragons which lived under stones and hissed like kettles. Dangerous varmints, very. Or suppose they were to come across one of the really big dragons. Suppose they was to run into a griffin. Sir Ector considered the prospect moodily for some time, then began to feel better. It would be a jolly good thing, he concluded, if Master Twitty and his beastly dogs did meet the questing beast. Yes, and got eaten up by it too, every one. Cheered by this vision, he turned round at the edge of the ploughing and stumped off home. At the hedge where the old lady lay waiting to scare rooks, he was lucky enough to spot some approaching pigeons before she was aware of him or them, which gave him a chance to let out such a screech that he felt amply repaid for his own jump by seeing hers. It was going to be a good evening after all. "Good night to you," said Sir Ector affably, when the old lady recovered herself enough to drop him a curtsy. He felt so much restored by this that he called on the parish priest, halfway up the village street, and invited him to dinner. Then he climbed to the solar, which was his special chamber, and sat down heavily to write a submissive message to King Uther in the 2 or 3 hours which remained to him before the meal. It would take him quite that time, what with sharpening pens, using too much sand to blot with, going to the top of the stairs to ask the butler how to spell things, and starting again if he had made a mistake. Sir Ector sat in the solar while the wintering sunlight threw broad orange beams across his bald head. He scratched and fluttered away, and laboriously bit the end of his pen, and the castle room darkened about him. It was a room as big as the main hall over which it stood, and it could afford to have large southern windows, because it was on the 2nd story. There were 2 fireplaces, in which the ashy logs of wood turned from gray to red as the sunlight retreated. Round these some favorite hounds lay snuffling in their dreams, or scratching themselves for fleas, or gnawing mutton bones which they had scrounged from the kitchens. The peregrine falcon stood hooded on a perch in the corner, a motionless idol, dreaming of other skies. If you were to go now to view the solar of Castle Savage, you would find it empty of furniture, but the sun would still stream in at those stone windows 2 feet thick, and as it barred the mullions, it would catch a warmth of sandstone from them, the amber light of age. If you went to the nearest curiosity shop, you might find some clever copies of the furniture which it was supposed to contain. These would be oak chests and cupboards with Gothic paneling, and strange faces of men or angels, or devils, carved darkly upon them, black, beeswaxed, worm-eaten, and shiny, gloomy testimonies to the old life in their coffin-like solidity. But the furniture in the solar was not like that. The devil's heads were there, and the linen fold paneling, but the wood was 6 or 7 or 8 centuries younger. So in the warm-looking light of sunset, it was not only the mullions which had an amber glow. All the spare, strong chests in the room, they were converted for sitting by laying bright carpets on them, were the young, the golden oak, and the cheeks of the devils and cherubim shone as if they had been given a good soaping.